I said when I released him. So what? Said Kenneth. Well, what aren't you telling me? Why did you make sure I was alone to spring it on me? Does she have 2 heads or something? Is she a felon? I was trying to joke, but I could tell it wasn't going over well. He sighed. Naomi's part of... Well, her family is only kind of Mormon. Kind of Mormon? What does that mean? With Kenneth's doubts about the church, I really hadn't expected him to marry a devout churchgoer, but that was obviously why he was nervous about telling Kurt. He must want me to act as an intermediary, to get Kurt used to the idea that they weren't going to get married in the temple, sealed, as Mormon couples are, in an eternal family in this life and the celestial kingdom, not just married till death, as in other religious traditions. Kenneth sighed again and rubbed at his head in a way that reminded me of Kurt, if Kurt had had more hair. I guess there's no easy way to say it, Mom. Her family is polygamous. I was so shocked I had to gather my thoughts. Of all my sons, Kenneth was the last one I would have expected to be interested in a polygamous branch of Mormonism. I was really not sure how I was going to handle it if Kenneth were about to tell me he'd be having multiple wives, if that was what he planned for the future with this Naomi Carter. I'd never really accepted the polygamous past of the Mormon Church, and had always assumed I'd never have to. I thought I'd raised Kenneth to think the same way. Are they FLDS? I asked slowly. The Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints was the most infamous polygamist branch of Mormonism, led by the now jailed prophet Warren Jeffs, who had been indicted for statutory rape after he married dozens of barely teenage girls, some of whom were also his close blood relatives. Just the idea of Kenneth sitting down for Sunday dinner with men who did that made me sick. I suddenly wished that Kurt were here after all. Not the FLDS, Mom, Kenneth said. Her family is independent and very modern. Her dad is an OB/GYN at Salt Lake Regional. One of the wives is an investment broker and another is an artist. Naomi is in med school, too. She wants to be an OB/GYN like her father. He held my gaze as if he were begging me not to judge him just yet. I struggled not to make a remark about it being a lot cheaper to have a lot of babies if you were a baby doctor yourself. Okay, I said, hoping I knew my son as well as I thought I did. Are you two planning to be polygamous? He snorted. Of course not, Mom. I'm just trying to make sure you understand her history. And when you meet her parents, her father and her mother's, you aren't caught by surprise. I felt an enormous wave of relief. Mormons hadn't been polygamous since the late 1800s, when the prophet and president Wilford Woodruff had ended the practice. Sometimes I heard older Mormons say that God was polygamous, or that polygamy was still going to be required in heaven, but it wasn't a topic I'd heard mentioned in general conference, and I figured that was clear evidence that it wasn't part of the modern church anymore. How did you meet her? I asked, glad to get back to being a nosy mother. There was a long pause, and I realized we weren't done with the difficult part of the conversation. We met at a former Mormons group. We call it Mormons Anonymous. Mormons Anonymous? Like Alcoholics Anonymous or Gamblers Anonymous? As if my religion were some kind of addictive behavior that you had to recover from? I knew you were having trouble with the church, I said carefully, waiting for him to explain. Mom, the final straw was the exclusion policy. I felt a gut punch at this and found myself holding on to the kitchen counter to keep from sinking to the floor. The exclusion policy had been leaked to the press in November of 2015, and it directed that all same-sex married members must be excommunicated, and their children disallowed saving ordinances like baptism, as well as participation in other church activities. I had always loved my church, but this was the one thing about it that I simply could not defend. Samuel had struggled with the policy right after he turned in his mission papers, but he had